Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and salam sejahtera. A very good afternoon to our distinguished guests and speakers. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Amshar from Brunei Darussalam Central Bank, and I'll be your MC for this afternoon's event. Welcome to the hybrid seminar on the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance version 3. On behalf of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, a few housekeeping rules. Firstly, all online attendees will be muted for the duration of the hybrid event. The chat function has been disabled, so should you have any questions during the panel session, please submit them through the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen. You may also like certain questions to push them up to the top of the list. Please remember to include the name of the person to whom your question is directed to, or indicate if the question is open to all of the speakers. A gentle reminder that this event is also recorded. So without further ado, I'd like to start with the next agenda, which is the keynote address, which will be delivered by Yang Mulia Puan Hajah Nur Rafidah Sulaiman, the chair of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board. So without further ado, Puan Hajah Nur Rafidah, the floor is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Mr. Peter Rosencraft, the Finance Sector Specialist for the Finance Sector ASEAN Development Bank, who is actually present virtually, distinguished members of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, esteemed panelists and valued participants. So, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and a very good afternoon from Bandar Seri Begawan, Brunei Darussalam. So firstly, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to each and every one of you for taking the time to attend this hybrid seminar today in conjunction with the release of the version 3 of the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance. And as chair of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, it gives me great pleasure to be able to deliver the keynote address at this afternoon's event, which marks yet another important milestone in the ASEAN sustainability journey. So ladies and gentlemen, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board released version 3 of the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance on the 27th of March of this year. And today we would like to physically commemorate the publication of the ASEAN Taxonomy version 3 here in Bandar Seri Begawan, Brunei Darussalam. And the ASEAN Taxonomy Board believes that today's program serves as an opportunity to harness the potential of the ASEAN Taxonomy as a transition and inclusive taxonomy guiding us towards a sustainable future. So the ASEAN Taxonomy is an overarching guide to assess sustainable activities across ASEAN, which complements each ASEAN's country's sustainable finance initiatives. And the ASEAN Taxonomy Board counts every ASEAN member state as being present on its board, making the taxonomy project an initiative that is participated in by everyone. So in this version 3 of the ASEAN Taxonomy, we included the technical screening criteria, the TSC, for 2 focus sectors of the Plus standard, namely the transportation and storage, as well as the construction and real estate. And this follows the version 2, which introduces the technical screening criteria for the energy sector, being the first of the 6 focus sector in the Plus standards, and where the foundation framework was also completed, which allows any ASEAN member states to apply the framework to immediately commence the sustainability journey. So version 2 was recently made effective on the 19th of February after incorporating feedback from stakeholders consultation. And similarly, version 3 will undergo a stakeholders consultation process involving participants from the government sector, the financial institutions, relevant real economy sectors, and international organizations to seek feedback on the criteria introduced to assess the transport and construction activities. And in the broader ecosystem of sustainable finance, we're heartened to see the growth of the sustainable frameworks across the region since the release of version 1 of the ASEAN Taxonomy back in November 2021. And in the intervening period to date, taxonomies for Indonesia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand have been released, as well as the Sustainable and Responsible Investment, the SRI taxonomy for the Malaysian capital market from SC Malaysia to supplement the earlier released taxonomy from Bank Negara Malaysia. So significant effort has been expended to ensure there's alignment of key design elements, including threshold for relevant activities between the ASEAN taxonomy and these national taxonomies, thus reinforcing the ASEAN taxonomy role as a common language for sustainable finance in the region and the importance of an inclusive overarching guide for the region. And concurrently, the transition imperative advocated in the ASEAN taxonomy has gained significant traction globally, and all ASEAN member states' taxonomies released to date have incorporated the transition activities and guidance in their respective documents, and undoubtedly such effort collectively support an orderly and just transition in our ASEAN region. As part of today's program, a panel session has been put together with our distinguished guest speaker from Mizuho Financial Group, the ASEAN Investor Group on Climate Change, and the Malaysia Green Building Council, which will be moderated by the ATB host, which is Sustainable Finance Institute Asia, Sophia. And the panel will discuss on facilitating sustainability transitions in the real economy, as well as how the ASEAN taxonomy may assist such efforts to enable a regional approach that can guide and supplement activities that mark a country's transition path. So in closing, I would like to record my appreciation to the members of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board for their participation in the taxonomy development since 2021 and the diligent and hard work of the ASEAN taxonomy host, the Sustainable Finance Institute Asia, Sophia, in coordinating efforts that has led to the publication of the 3 iterations of the ASEAN taxonomy thus far. And I would also like to express my sincere gratitude to the ASEAN Development Bank for the continued valuable support, both technical and financial support on this taxonomies project. So before I conclude my keynote, I would just like to mention that the ATB conducted a post-publication review following version 3's launch in late March. So certain contents and copy amendments were made, which are reflected in version 3 dated 25th of April, which is today, which will be posted onto the ASEAN and the ACMF and Sophia website later on today. So with that, I would like to end my keynote address by thanking everyone for allocating your valuable time to be with us for today's event, and I wish you all an enriching and productive seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ponaja and Rafida, for the remarks and welcome. Moving on to the next agenda, which is the special remarks by Mr. Peter Rosenkrantz. Mr. Peter Rosenkrantz is the Financial Sector Specialist at the Finance Sector Office of the ASEAN Development Bank, ADB. As we know, the ADB is also providing technical and financial support for the development of the ASEAN taxonomy. It gives me great pleasure to invite Mr. Rosenkrantz to take the screen. Mr. Rosenkrantz, it's all yours.
Good afternoon, Deputy Managing Director Sulaiman, members of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, and all delegates and participants. It's a real great pleasure to joining you for this important launch seminar of the version 3 of the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance. And I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the organizers for this invitation and the opportunity to represent the ADB in this important workshop and to share some brief remarks. So the Asian Development Bank is deeply committed to fostering sustainable finance within the ASEAN region. For instance, we support this through our technical assistance to the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum and the ASEAN Taxonomy Board to promote inclusivity and resilience while strengthening regulatory coherence and deepening engagement with the private sector and capital market stakeholders. The technical assistance combines capacity building for regulators, critical policy advice, and knowledge work tailored to promote interconnected and sustainable capital markets in the ASEAN region. In relation to that, we are very pleased to have supported the development of the ASEAN taxonomy, including its recent update of version 3. This regional taxonomy is a crucial tool in advancing sustainable finance practices across the region, and it is very encouraging to see the inclusion of the transportation and storage and construction real estate sectors in the technical screening criteria in this update, further enhancing the taxonomy's scope and reach. Hence, big congratulations to the ASEAN Taxonomy Board for this very significant achievement. A regional taxonomy coupled with a specific transition finance guidance plays a critical and catalytic role in setting the frameworks for mobilizing urgently need in green finance. Not only facilitating sustainable credit investment, but also fostering transparency, uniformity, and also reliability in climate finance instruments. In the end, it allows for investors and issuers to better compare an investment's contribution to climate change, thereby gauging the project's green footprints and ultimately make better and more informed decisions. Hence, the significance of the ASEAN taxonomy in facilitating a sustainable and just transition cannot be overstated. Efforts to ramp up green and sustainable finance are often hindered by a lack of universally agreed upon definitions, and therefore a regional taxonomy such as the ASEAN taxonomy really plays a critical role in addressing these gaps. At the ADB, we remain fully committed to spearheading just transition initiatives in the region, and we channel efforts into funding initiatives that aim to scale up sustainable financing through collaboration between the public sector, multilateral development banks, but of course also the private sector. Notable examples include the ASEAN Investment Fund and the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility. The ASEAN Taxonomy and Transition Finance Guidance align well with ADB's goals for a just and affordable transition in the ASEAN region, thereby complementing ADB-supported initiatives such as the energy transition mechanism intended to facilitate and accelerate early coal phase-out. As we navigate the urgent need to move toward net zero, we must acknowledge that time is of the essence. So while we really acknowledge the very good progress, we must also recognize that our journey is far from over, and there are still significant strides to be made. As regards the future evolution of the ASEAN taxonomy and furthering thereof, we look forward to supporting its development, including in the form of a version 4 and related consultations. Two aspects I would like to highlight in that regard. First, it will be crucial to continue with our efforts to assure its interoperability with other regional taxonomies, such as the EU taxonomy. Second, we look forward to engaging in greater detail on nature and biodiversity finance aspects in the next update, including through the development of specific technical screening criteria for the protection of healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. We also hope to collaborate and jointly develop an ASEAN nature and transition plan. With that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to a rich and enlightening discussions that lie ahead in our workshop today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenkrantz. Our next speaker will be presenting an overview of version 3 of the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance, which was released on the 27th of March. As mentioned by Yang Mulia Puan Raja Rafida and also Mr. Rosenkrantz in their remarks, this latest version builds on the work that has been done before and introduces assessment methodology for the transportation and storage and construction and real estate focused sectors. So without further ado, I would like to invite Ms. Azalina Adham, member of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board and chair of the Working Group for Market Facing and Resourcing, to deliver her presentation. The floor is yours.
It's easy, not so easy. Assalamualaikum and good afternoon. Puan Haja Nurafida, Chair of ASEAN Taxonomy Board, Mr. Peter Rosenkrantz, who is the Finance Specialist Sector Specialist of ADB, who is joining us online, fellow members of the ATB who are here, as well as the distinguished panelists that we will have later, and ladies and gentlemen who are joining us both in person as well as online. First and foremost, my name is Azalina, and I wanted to take this opportunity to really personally thank Madam Chair and colleagues from BDCB to actually hosting us today in Bandar Sri Begawan. Many of us, it's our first time to Brunei. For me, it's the second time after a very long time, so thank you, Madam Chair. And it is my honor to be able to share with the audience an overview of the ASEAN Taxonomy version 3 that introduces two new sectors, which is an effort that I am very proud of, actually, collectively, a great big effort, I think. So without much ado, I'm going to start that presentation, but before going in, I just wanted to share on the next slide, if I may. The next slide, yeah. Just a few minutes around this. People sometimes take this a little bit for granted, but this is one of the most, to my mind, one of the most brilliant formation to ever been done. This ATB was actually set up under the auspices of the ASEAN Finance Ministers and General and Central Bank Governors, AFMGM, back in March of 2021, where they felt that it was critical to have a common taxonomy, really to bring everyone together and set up the ATB to develop and maintain and promote a common taxonomy for ASEAN. Now, what is unique about ASEAN, it is represented across all 10 member states, all 10, and it is also representative of all the different regulators, as you see, the capital market regulators, the insurance regulators, there is senior level committees for financial integration, and of course, the central bankers are also there. So having this confluence of all the regulators in one sitting is probably one of the greatest achievement in how we have been able to deliver in these 3 years. It's a very, very young organization or group, about 3 years of having delivered the many, many things that we have done. So I'm really very proud to be part of this group, though our work is not quite done yet, Madam Chair, but so here I wanted to take a moment to share that. On the next slide, if you may, it shows the achievements that we have. So we have already seen many sort of interactions that we have with stakeholders internationally. Again, wanted to share a little bit on that progress, having international recognition and international acceptance, especially since we launched the Plus standard, which was only done a year ago in March of 2023. It's not been that long. But I wanted to share a few things with you. For example, in the first one, GFANS has actually made reference to the ASEAN taxonomy with regards to coal phase out. That's one. Secondly, if you look at, and GFANS is a group of coalition of financial institutions internationally. Second is the ASEAN Transition Finance Group, which is a Japanese and ASEAN grouping as well, has also acknowledged this as one of the major initiatives, especially with regards to coal phase out. On the next slide, you also find that we also have been regarded as one of the 3 most influential taxonomies, of course, along EU and the CBI green taxonomy, which are generally a little bit older and more mature, but having recognized this, and the Natixis is actually a French banking group that has also recognized this. The last and probably the most interesting, and that's something we would really like to see more of, is that the ASEAN taxonomy has actually been named as one of the 3 acceptable taxonomies by the Financial Services Regulator of Abu Dhabi Global Markets. So I think as we go and work together at this, we want to be able to get more and more traction around the acceptance of the ASEAN taxonomy. So in doing so, that's just a little bit of the show and tell, but let me get down to the version 3 itself. On the next slide. So there are 5 key principles that we really hold true as we develop and as we continue to develop the ASEAN taxonomy, which I think has helped us sort of manage the way sometimes we have differences and how we align to make sure that it does achieve all these 5. The first, very quickly, is that the ASEAN taxonomy will be an overarching guide to set a common language for all of us and still give enough latitude for each of the member states to develop, if it wishes, their national taxonomies. So it's quite a nice place to be able to house everyone in the region. Second is a just and orderly transition. As everyone appreciates within ASEAN, as in many regions, we have countries of different stages of development, and therefore in the ASEAN taxonomy approach, we are very, very we guard that very dearly, which brings us to the third principle, which is about inclusiveness. The fourth principle, which is one of the frames that we take to make sure that we're also then internationally recognized, is that the taxonomy ought to be credible and science-based. So there's also a lot of rigor and discussions around this topic. And the last principle is, again, because we're a confluence of many different sectors, we also take painstaking discussions to make sure that it doesn't run in conflict between the different sectors. So there's a lot of work. So you find that in the ASEAN taxonomy development, a lot of effort is put in place for consultation pre the design, during the design, and even after that design is being done. So if I can just take you very quickly then next to the overall design of the ASEAN taxonomy. The ASEAN taxonomy is multi-tiered. It has an ability to have both the frames of a principle, or what we call the foundation framework, as well as a criteria base of plus standards. The foundation framework, which is a foundation framework that we have, was completed in February this year. It was launched last year. It has since been completed this year. It has a set of questions. It enables member states or companies that are commencing their journey to at least start without the scary criteria and science-based thresholds. So that's one. For plus standards, we actually launched the version 2, which deals with the electricity sector or power generation and carbon capture, storage and utilization, and introduce social aspects as the items marked in red. We introduced it last year, and also the final version was published in February this year after a consultation period as well. And today we are here to share with you the third version, which covers two sectors, which is transportation and storage, as well as construction and real estate. The documentation was published, as the MC had mentioned, in March this year. We will commence the formal consultation between July to around October this year. This is the actual engagements that we will be doing. That being said, the document is already available online for everybody to read and consume, and so that you'll be ready when we're ready to consult with you, so to give you time. We are targeting to get the version published, or the final version, by next year or first quarter of next year. On the next slide, now there are three things when we look at this in terms of the taxonomy, three key considerations for version 3. I'll take you to number 2 and number 3 first, because they're the easiest to be talking about. The alignment of ASEAN member states, very crucial to us all the time, that is making sure that we don't run incongruent with national taxonomies that are being developed. We have our fellow ASEAN members who are constantly looking at the development of their national taxonomies. So in the effort as the team designs this, it is always looking to see how are the other taxonomy. Indonesia, OJK is looking at that now. So everybody is keeping track of that. Secondly, is we update, and it's a live document, as we say it. So we always add in any developments or any new regulations for completeness. The most distinct differences, I guess, in the version 3 is under tier 1, under item 1, which is called tier setting. Basically, it is still a sector where we actually still look at trying to make sure that it is staying true to the principles that we talk about. We are looking at it being interoperable with international taxonomies, be it EU or CBI. But what is interesting here is the fact that we have found that we have added one more criteria, or what we call the widening of the screening criteria, to include international or national industry standards as another form of criteria for them to be able to distinguish which tier they're at. Now, the inclusion of this is as long as the aspiration of the 1.5-degree target and that is science-based remains true. Now, the reason why this was done is we find that there are more nuances in these sectors, which is the construction and real estate, as well as the transportation and storage. Whereas in the power generation, you could just measure the emission with ease. But here, I think there's a lot more complexity around that. So that is one of the reasons why there is an inclusion or the widening of how the criteria can actually be determined. Essentially so that is a primary difference that we have. And for example, in the case of to look at the construction and real estate sector, we, as well as for that sector, we looked at the green building certification as one alternative. In the case of transport and storage, we look at the International Maritime Organization, GHG strategy. So it's to provide these different nuances beyond just what is already existing in other taxonomies. On the next slide, so in the transportation and storage activity, there are 17 activities covered here across all land, water, and air subsectors, all covered. I won't go through them, you can read them, but I wanted to highlight that it covers infrastructure as well as vehicles for land and water. However, for the air activity, it's only the infrastructure that we have covered. We have not covered, and that is quite deliberate on our part. We have excluded the air transport vehicles simply because there is ongoing and an active discussion going on in EU around the categories and the criteria. And I think what was a decision that was being made by the team, the ETB team, was to probably wait and look at see where the development is, rather than have it be evolving together as well. So this is probably something that we will be coming back with later. But in the design of what is available in the version 3, infrastructure is for all 3 subsectors, but vehicle is only for land and water activities. On the next sector, which is the construction and real estate, there are 9 activities here, and it cuts across building, ancillary activities, technology, and equipment. Again, this particular sector makes reference to international and national green building codes, certification codes where available, or industry standards. This is to help establish a green or amber tier. And for jurisdictions or member states that doesn't have these kinds of codes, we hope that the ASEAN taxonomy can start as a beginning point for markets like that, to be able to at least use this as a reference point in the beginning. Now we go a little bit deeper into the taxonomy itself for the green tier. The blue bucket talks about the construction and real estate, and the orange one is transportation. So allow me again to explain that we still have both the green as well as amber. For purposes of the green, it does look to be actually where appropriate. It must also be aligned to, or we're looking at it being also used for where industry standards and both national and international standards can be used beyond just an existing taxonomy like EU. So where appropriate, we say that the construction sector can take into account the complexity of setting just a standardized threshold. Because of localized context of each industry, we are looking for the application of these industry standards that can be used. For example, the construction and real estate sector, where standards are much more dependent on local context, we are looking for screening criteria to be used, such as the green building certificate schemes and other credible national as well as international schemes to be able to actually have the inclusion here beyond just the taxonomy. But for this, it has to be the highest level of recognition, because in the schemes, there are also a lot of different tiers. So this should be at the highest tier. In terms of the transportation sector, for example, we are actually looking, transportation sector is a little bit easier in the sense that there is an emission reduction standard that you can look at. And for this, we use the alternate of the International Maritime, as I mentioned, as that alternative. So really, from the perspective of ASEAN, we felt it was imperative to have this included so that it reduces fragmentation within an industry standard and as well as what is happening within a particular jurisdiction, given that some of these sectors are more localized as opposed to it being an accepted global standard already. In terms of amber category, so green is always an easier conversation, is that the higher standard. Amber is always the trickier one, the more complex one, because this is the one that ASEAN taxonomy uses to house transition activity. So it's a very, very important sector or section for us. So for this, we actually look at this from the perspective, so I will just go into the construction and real estate. Now, construction and real estate, we only have the amber. If you look at, there is no, at the bottom, it says there is no amber tier 3. We only have amber tier 2. The reason for this is the way we look at it is a very binary assessment, because we talked about the certification. So whenever you're going in for a green building certification scheme, it is fairly binary in terms, are you or are you not? So if you are not at the highest level, as I mentioned, which will make you be a green tier, you will come into amber tier 2. So that there is no other way except to get yourself assessed, right? However, the transport and storage sector is a little bit different. You'll see it has both a tier 2 and a tier 3 mechanism. And this is because, as I mentioned earlier, this sector actually has stages of emission reduction that can take place. For example, the adoption of higher levels of Euro standards. So there is a progressive journey that can be taken. So for that, this particular sector will continue to have an amber tier 2 and amber tier 3. So that is kind of how we have approached into the details. Now, I wouldn't want to go too far in. The version 3 was just launched somewhat like under a month ago. I'm sure going into that space kind of, so I'm trying to just pique your interest to kind of begin to look at how it is different, what kind of industry standards are we using, what kind of international standards are we using. But really, in conclusion, we are inviting everyone to please take a look at both these sectors, as these sectors are very, very important to ASEAN. And therefore, the consultation period, which has commenced, but the formal engagement will begin in July, is very important for us to get feedback, especially from the ASEAN Day practitioners, to be able to look as to how we can fine-tune, if at all, the taxonomy version 3. On the next slide, we have just put a list of the different, so as I mentioned, there is a consultation period that will go on. We are commencing all the market-facing engagements, but we've also put it up as a link for anyone who is interested to understand where we're at with version 3 to have a look ahead of the consultation period. Thank you.
Thank you, Datin Azalina, for the presentation. The release of version 3 brings us to 3 focus sectors completed out of the 6 that the ASEAN taxonomy will eventually cover. So it becomes even more imperative now that we tackle the question of how to facilitate sustainability transitions in the real economy. Hence, this is a good segue to our next segment or next agenda, which is our panel sessions. Our panel session this afternoon will discuss, among others, how the taxonomy will assess ASEAN member states, the role of the multi-tiered approach in facilitating this transition, and what more is needed to enable a just transition in critical sectors of the real economy. To moderate this session is Mr. Eugene Wong, the CEO of the Sustainable Finance Institute Asia, SFIA. Joining him are a panel of experts, Mr. Shinichi Shinoda, General Manager, Sustainable Business Promotion Department, Mizuho Financial Group. Mr. Shinoda is responsible for the promotion of Mizuho's sustainable related business. He has over 25 years of experience in corporate finance and advisory in Japan, EMEA, and ASEAN regions. Previously, he spearheaded the ASEAN Office of Industry Research Department in Singapore, focusing in corporate advisory for local corporates in the ASEAN region, covering topics such as cross-border alliance, decarbonization, and sustainable supply chain. In 2022, He was appointed General Manager of the newly established Sustainable Business Promotion Department to facilitate sustainable related business in both financial and consulting areas. Panelist number 2, Ms. Anjali Vishwamohanan, Director, Policy, Asia Investor Group on Climate Change, AIGCC. At AIGCC, Ms. Vishwamohanan works with government and stakeholders in Asia, to build investable national climate, physical risk, and climate-related risk policies. In her previous role, she has spent several years advising policymakers and investors in emerging markets on various elements of energy transition and climate finance. Lastly, the last panelist, Mr. Mitch Gilber, CEO of Malaysia Green Building Council. Malaysia Green Building Council. Mr. Gilbert has extensive experience in the fields of architectural design and sustainability. Mr. Gilbert currently chairs Malaysia's GBC's Carbon Score Task Force, working towards the total decarbonization of Malaysia's building and construction sector. Prior to his appointment as CEO of Malaysia GBC, he previously served for more than 10 years as the Green Building Index certifier and technical committee member. He edited the 2019 book Greening Malaysia, Building Towards Sustainability, and has taught at the University of Malaya School of Architecture. I'd now like to invite all our panelists and moderator to join us on stage. Just as a gentle reminder, please, if you have any questions, please post them on the question and answer tab on the bottom of your screen. And if there are any live questions, please do provide them as well. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, thank you very much for being here, and thank you for the very kind introduction. To the panelists, thank you for joining us. This is a very important and topical area that I think affects all of us. So I'm really delighted to have you here today to share your experiences and your wisdom as well. So I actually want to reference back to some of the comments that were made by Madam Norafida, by Datin Nazarlina, and by Peter from ADB, and that's about just transition. So if I take a step back and think back of when we started working on the taxonomy and we wanted to focus on transition, there were a lot of skeptics at that time. But certainly within the last few years and few months, there have been a lot of changes from economic, social perspectives, as well as actually geopolitics. And I think there's a great wide acceptance now that transition is actually very important and that it's important for taxonomies to be transition driven. So we even see taxonomies of countries like Australia and Canada, which have built-in transition focus as well. So we can see that there's a lot of warming up actually to transition, and the fact that, as mentioned by Azalina just now, Netflix rating the ASEAN taxonomy as one of the 3 most influential, and the Abu Dhabi global market accepting the ASEAN taxonomy as one of the 3 taxonomies under its rulebook speaks for itself. But I just wanted to turn to you, Anjali, because you've been dealing a lot with the guys who give us the capital, the providers of capital. How can the ASEAN taxonomy actually support ASEAN's sustainability agenda, and how can investors leverage on it?
Thanks, Eugene, and thank you very much for having me today in Brunei to sort of talk about the ASEAN taxonomy, which I think is a very important framework to really guide climate finance into the region. So I'm quite honored to be a part of this event. So just to respond to your question, Eugene, I just want to take a step back and sort of just look at how the financial sector has been evolving in response to climate risk. There's been a lot of effort put into the financial sector to really get them to understand that climate risk is a financial risk. And now over the last decade, you've seen the financial sector really move in terms of making very high level commitments, which are quite rigorous as well. So one example is the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. You've seen over 315 asset managers and manage over 57 trillion USD in assets, committing to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So following a 1.5 aligned pathway. And what this essentially means is that this high level commitment really needs to translate into allocation of capital that will support the entire world achieving a net zero economy by 2050. So that's a huge pool of capital that is there, that's committed right now. And investors are not just looking at it in terms of investment decisions, they're really integrating this high level commitment into internal processes. You're looking at investors setting up governance frameworks internally to ensure that climate is integrated into their decisions. You're seeing investors engage with their companies, both current portfolio companies and future investment companies, to really understand what their emissions trajectory is going to be through a transition pathway. You're also seeing investors engage with policymakers to really understand how policy can help investors and companies really move and reach that sort of target. You're seeing investors advocate for frameworks such as disclosure that will make available data that will help investors understand companies and markets better, that will help them in decisions on how to allocate capital. And finally, there's that pillar of investments itself, right? You need to sort of ensure that your investments are in line to seek the opportunities associated with climate risk, but also look at the real risks associated with that and ensure that your capital is secure. So there's all of this that's happening in the financial sector, and you're seeing this translate to businesses as well, who's responding by looking at transition pathways, looking at them developing transition plans as well. Parallelly, you see a new set of risks emerge because of these sort of initiatives being taken by investors and companies, which is greenwashing and associated risks like transition washing, green hushing. And all of this, I think, is sort of quite imperative to also hold to account the way that capital is being directed towards transition. You're seeing there are a number of misrepresentations being made regarding business strategies and investment strategies, which are claimed to be green, but perhaps are not. And so this level of accountability is also necessary. And in this background, you see frameworks like taxonomy is developed, which really provides an answer to these newer risks, but then also existing risks in the market, right? Like the climate risk, but also really highlighting opportunities. I think just to sort of put the ASEAN taxonomy in this context, it really sort of opens up the ASEAN market, sort of enabling investors and businesses to really understand how ASEAN is positioning itself towards sustainability and sustainable objectives. So investors are really able to understand the different countries within ASEAN because of the common language framework, and are able to sort of look at ASEAN as an integral market for transition and allocate capital accordingly. You're also using taxonomy as a framework to really alleviate risks like greenwashing by providing companies and clarity in terms of what transition is and what green could be in sort of like different economies. So I think all of these are really essential in the current framework that we are in to position ASEAN to sort of, leverage these opportunities effectively, but also really help the financial sector to sort of put all of these building blocks on data, on transition plans, on transition technologies very clearly in a framework that also takes into account regional contexts. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali. So with that, let me turn to Sunoda-san. Sunoda-san, Japan is a big trade partner for ASEAN. It's actually a big provider of finance and capital for ASEAN. And it's also a big advocate for transition. So if we look at the Japanese approach, the Japanese sectoral roadmaps actually don't have technical screening criteria, but they provide essentially a technology roadmap over a period of time. The ASEAN taxonomy doesn't have a technology angle. It's really technology neutral, but it has technical screening criteria over a period of time. So while they are slightly different, they both actually help drive transition and facilitate it. So I just wanted to get your views on how you think the ASEAN taxonomy can be used to facilitate transition, and of course, how it can also work with the Japanese approach.
Well, thank you very much, Yoji-san. So first of all, I'm pretty much honored to participate in this kind of event. I certainly believe that version 3 of the ASEAN taxonomy is a huge, the step towards the, have a kind of a common understanding what is appropriate, the transition is. I recall I met Eugene about 2 years ago. We've been speaking about what is our transition is. I don't think we haven't get to the 100% answer yet, but I think this kind of the work to toward to have a common kind of understanding what is the problem. I think this is important was now my understanding of ASEAN taxonomy is that, as Eugene-san has pointed out, it gives a really good clarity what is the transition, appropriate transition in terms of the asset or technology with by 2030 or 2035, especially this tiering as project amber, that will give you, which one could be financed and which one cannot be financed. And I think it gives us a good guidance from the banking sector like us when we deal with the clients. Now, the biggest difference with the Japanese version of the technology roadmap is that the Japanese version is more on the kind of coming from like a strategy side or the corporate strategy side. Now, it was 2021, the Japanese government has announced the Japanese version of the International Finance Handbook. And that was basically led by Ministry of Trade and Industry, together with the Ministry of Environment and the JFSA, the regulators. So one of the uniqueness is it was really driven by the industry strategy of the Japan as a whole. So following that, on 2021, the roadmap for the steel sector was announced, followed by the chemical and the power, if I understand correctly. And so far, there have been the roadmap for the 8 sectors. Now, what the announcement roadmap has brought is that my understanding is, speaking with our Japanese clients, at least most of the major company in heavy industry in Japan has at least considered applying the transition finance to their the financing. Because in Japan, what labeling your finance as transition finance is basically obtaining the authority by the Japanese government that your transition business plan is in line with the Japanese industry, the policy or strategy up to 2050. So clearly there's a motivation for the Japanese company to apply for the transition finance because you can kind of demonstrate you are in line with the Japanese government policies. And if you look at the Japanese, the roadmap, it basically tells you by 2030, you're gonna have to adapt this technology by 2040, you're gonna have to do this. And it is very easy for the Japanese corporates to embed that concept to the long-term business planning 2050. So clearly, there was an effect to motivate the Japanese corporates to embed the transitional strategy or decarbonization activities in their long-term business plan up to 2050. Now the challenge is, so unlike ASEAN taxonomy or the European taxonomies, it do have a lack in some extent the clarity of what would that really lead to the 2050 carbon neutrality, or is it in line with the Paris Agreement or 1.5 degree, in terms of like a speed of decarbonization up to 2050. So my view is, while we, as a Japanese, the bank, we do refer to the roadmap, what the Japanese government has announced, also referring to the ASEAN taxonomy or the other taxonomy where appropriate region by regions, and kind of a mix and come up with a kind of best practice for the bank, taking account your business portfolio or Japanese, our client base. I think that's the kind of the strategy that we are trying to take. going forward.
Thank you, Sunoda-san. That's really encouraging because we see a practical application for the ASEAN taxonomy. Mitch, we heard a lot from providers of capital because Anjali spoke on the investor side and Sunoda-san on the bank side, but you represent a group of users of capital. So can you share with us a bit about the utility of the ASEAN taxonomy for the stakeholders that you represent?
Thank you, Eugene. It's really a privilege to be here this afternoon. And, like you mentioned, I have the honor of representing us from a stakeholder perspective. My background is in architecture, and I'm here representing construction and real estate sector and the various stakeholders involved in our industry. So I have a slightly different view of these mechanisms and the work at hand. The first thing that needs to be acknowledged is the critical role of ASEAN taxonomy to facilitate cross-border investment, to serve as an amplifier of the opportunities that are available to stakeholders in various industries as part of this sustainability transition. But my perspective is slightly different. For me, the primary beneficiary of a mechanism like the taxonomy is to the financial sector itself, not to the end user. The end user will, investment is required for building and construction projects. The primary beneficiary of instruments like the ASEAN taxonomy is to provide feedback and mechanisms within the financial sector itself to help the financial sector capitalize and stay ahead of the curve on this transition. Because this is a transition that is occurring globally with us or without us. And the construction sector is complex. The taxonomy that we're talking about with the international framework is a mechanism to provide common language for different capital organizations, different financing and financial instruments to be able to communicate with each other using a common language. When we talk about construction, this is an inherently local activity. And so engagement from high level and cross-border capital into a local, a national and local endeavor is complex and has inherent risk. So these frameworks give confidence to investors. They provide points of access to access these projects. But most of all, they allow investment into the inherent advantages of sustainable building practices. Speaking from the construction sector, what at the very basic level, what green building is, what sustainable building is a more efficient building, a higher performing building. And a higher performing building, just by default, is a safer investment. The challenge, one of the challenges with green finance, and this is a more general observation, is that by designating something as sustainable finance, designating something as green finance, there's an unintended implication that it's playing by its own set of rules. This is green finance, and it's something that is operating by a separate set of rules than just economic performance. We need to carve out, and historically, this has largely been the case. For sustainable transition to happen, we needed to include externalities. We needed to include mechanisms for incentivizing investment in something that was seen as an inherently unattractive investment or lesser attractive investment. And this is increasingly an antiquated view of the world. So one of the ways that we see that manifest, and I'll wrap this up quickly, but one of the ways that we see this manifest in the construction sector is that there's a prevalent perception that a green building is a more expensive building. And this is across borders across levels of development, across jurisdictions, that if you're going to make your building perform more efficiently, there's a price tag that's associated with it. And this is simply not true. Buildings by their very definition are bespoke. They're tailor-made to suit the requirements of a particular client, particular activity, or particular jurisdiction. And the building construction sector works on a budget. That budget is specific to that project. That's the reason why we don't go to a store. The overwhelming majority of buildings are not purchased on a store shelf. They're designed from the ground up to suit their physical context, their economic context, their social context, and their cultural context. And within those mechanisms, you can design a high-performing building on a low budget. You can design a high-performing building with a higher budget. No matter what your budget is, there's moves that you can make and strategies you can employ to improve the efficiency of that building. So again, to wrap it up, the magic question is, how much does green building cost? And from our experience in Malaysia, the average cost of achieving a certified green building ranges from 0 to 2% of construction cost. And that's the mean. That's not the median. On average, the incremental expenditure, CAPEX, involved to upgrade your building to green is 0 to 1% for residential, 0 to 2% for commercial buildings. And this is the CAPEX. Buildings pay for themselves. We have operational costs. So that's not even taking into consideration lower operating expenses and lifetime cost of the building. So increasingly, we're seeing an acknowledgement and a recognition of a evolving economic reality related to sustainability and the impact on the industry as a whole. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really interesting because often when we talk about the taxonomy and we talk to the average man on the street, it's always about the taxonomy is going to help guide providers of capital, but in reality, it also provides a lot of guidance to businesses because then they get to understand what it takes to be sustainable and what sustainable really means. And another important point, Mitch, that you raised, and it's interesting because I've also had this conversation with several big players in the supply chain. The transition is happening whether or not we like it. And if you're not going to be part of it, you will be out of the game. So Nada-san, I just wanted to come back to something you talked about just now. And really, I was trying to look at the alignment of the ASEAN taxonomy because the ASEAN taxonomy is generally aligned to the green tier of the EU, to the EU taxonomy through its green tier, but it also has those amber tiers as well. And you mentioned just now that, of course, for FIs coming from different jurisdictions, they would also be following different approaches. Like in Japan, use a roadmap. In EU, they use the EU taxonomy. So I'm just wondering, how is the ASEAN taxonomy's amber tiers useful to institutions like this? And you did mention a bit about it, and I thought it was really interesting. So I wanted to follow up on that question, the answer that you gave. And also, I will understand that it is natural that there'll be gaps between how the ASEAN taxonomy looks at things and how banks' assessment frameworks look at things. How do you close this gap, and what's a good approach for it?
Again, thank you for using. I think your question, basically, I don't have an answer to, but I'll try my best. Now, because that's the kind of the discussion that we're continuously having. But one of the things that we always try to make sure is that transition is a very local. So we cannot apply the one for Japan, and we're not trying to apply something that the EU has established. And I'm sure that ASEAN has the unique one. And my understanding, ASEAN taxonomy does say that the detail have to be determined by each countries. Now, that I think there was a mentioning about the orderly transitions. So in a way, just just doing the decarbonization pretty much easy because all you have to do is just stop all the economic activities from tomorrow. And I think your CO2 is going to be down. But that's not realistic. So, achieving the sustainable economic growth or industry development, achieving them at the same time, that's the way the difficulty comes. And each region has a different industry component, and so does the industry strategies. So therefore, what the appropriate transition should differ by local. Now, so we are based in Japan, and we have a significant exposure in the ASEAN region as well, and so does in US and Europe. So we're trying to apply the different strategy in terms of transition, taking account that each regions what is the appropriate transition, which we don't have the right answer at the moment. And that obviously the reason excuse for not having the the changing in the policies. There was a little bit change in the policy, for instance, by Ukraine crisis a year ago, and the technology evolving. So today, some technology are unproven. Maybe next year that's going to be proven. So it will change. So that's kind of my excuse that I don't have the 100% answer to transition. I'll try my best. And one of the things that, as Eugene asked, the gap between the ASEAN taxonomy maybe and our policy is our business portfolio or Japanese our client base. Now, if you speak with the, other peer banks, whether it's European, US, or our Japanese banks, there is a slightly difference in a way of looking at the transition, and that most of the case comes from the client base. Mizuho, this is 151st year anniversary, and we were basically developed or established to promote the Japanese industry from scratch. Therefore, our characteristic is that we have a heavy the client base among the Japanese heavy industries, power, steel, chemical, and so on. So probably we are the most CO2 intensive bank in global basis. So therefore, if we compare to the banks with a different business portfolio, the way we think the transition or how the approach to transition should be different, and it could be quite different. And we're gonna have to come up with our own, approach to judge what is the appropriate transition business plan in local basis, or which technology is appropriate until when. And so when we do so, again, we look at the ASEAN taxonomy or other taxonomy, the relevant, commonly used, but also we look at the business, our business portfolio. We speak with the clients. So we really emphasize the importance of engagement with the government and also our the clients. So I don't have an answer to that, but that's the kind of approach that we're trying to take.
I think that's a pretty good answer, and we weren't really expecting anything very firm. But it is important that we come back and remember that when the Paris Agreement was formulated, we also did have this concept of common but differentiated responsibilities. And if you look at a bank that's 151 years old and having provided long-term developmental finance, if you suddenly cut off, not only will we go back to the Stone Age, I mean, if you look at the amount of social economic dislocations, it is actually very much against the tenets of a just transition, which the speakers talked about just now. Anjali, I'm just wondering, we've heard the bank perspective, but from the investor perspective, how does this play out? Also, I wanted to ask you, because we talk so much about just transitions, we also do have a do no significant harm criteria in the ASEAN taxonomy, as with others, and remedial measures to transition. So I just wanted to ask, what your views are, and also whether or not we are internationally compatible in the way we look at things, both from a taxonomy and transition perspective.
Great. Thanks, Eugene. I think I'd just like to build on Tsunoda-san's comments. I think the approach from the investor side is sort of quite similar. a lot of the asset managers, asset owners, they're providers of long-term capital. They are also very keen on sort of engaging. I think it's quite like commonsensical to sort of assume that there will not be complete alignment between investor screening criteria and ASEAN taxonomy. It's quite common because like the sort of screening criteria for investors comes from a number of factors, like the jurisdictions that they are based in, what they are mandated to follow based on where they're headquartered in, their own internal exclusions and other policies. So there will never be sort of complete alignment. But I think the larger picture to sort of look at here is that there will be takers for different categories within the taxonomy as well. And that's an emerging trend that we are seeing. We will definitely see that there's a huge pool of investors that would be interested in investing in companies that are aligned with the green category or sort of undertaking those activities, because it is quite aligned with that Paris Agreement 1.5 aligned pathway with the EU taxonomy. And there is a huge pool of investments that's interested in sort of going to that category. But I'm just sort of coming from Singapore, and last week in Singapore, there was Ecosperity, which is this, I think it's coming to be known as a sustainable investment forum for Asia. And so it was a really interesting action-packed week. And I think the theme of the event over the course of the entire week was transitioning for Asia. And what really stood out to me is that the focus on finance throughout that week was not just on private capital, it was not just on public capital, but it was really about bringing the different types of capital into the picture. We were speaking to development finance institutions, we were speaking to philanthropies that have a very increasing role to play in transitioning in Asia. They're a part of a number of conversations around coal phase out, transition finance, which I think is all integral in sort of bringing this picture together, because it's not just one type of capital that will feed into the different transition needs. So I think the amber category that way in the ASEAN taxonomy will cater to a pool of capital that's very interested in supporting transitioning for ASEAN countries. And there is a lot of effort that's going into this. I can say this from the perspective of AIGCC, which works with over 70 investor members that manage over 32 trillion USD in assets. So like, they are also, you see different models that investors are also developing in creating pools of capital that can support transition alone in sort of raising the ambition for high ambition, high emitting companies across sectors to be able to set standards for the other companies to be able to follow suit and to ensure that transition is able to happen faster across Asia. So you're seeing different innovations in terms of finance to really sort of approach transition. And I think the ASEAN taxonomy is really enabling that sort of innovation with the financial sector as well, and the company level transition plans. Secondly, Eugene, on your question on do no significant harm and just transition, I think the way that it is structured in the ASEAN taxonomy right now is quite sort of, it helps you think about what are the questions that you need to really consider. And also it forces you to take into account the specific aspects with regard to the different states based on their own development trajectories. And I think that's a very important sort of perspective to have as a part of taxonomy. And the concept of just transition as well, I think has forced, the financial sector and associated agencies to really respond to try and understand what these nuances are better, to be able to put them in that context when you're sort of looking at a company level just transition plan, to be able to understand the nuances within which they operate and help investors really question these transition plans that companies are making and understand to what extent they're able to factor in these just transition elements, and also respond to it through finance, like looking at finance to support just transition. You're seeing platforms and initiatives like the Just Transition Finance Lab, which stemmed out of the London School of Economics, which is really trying to look at the practicalities of just transition across markets, but really focusing on Asia as well in its first year of work. AIGCC as well is starting a Just Transition working group to help investors really understand these nuances better, and to be held accountable as well in the way that they allocate capital to take into account these factors. Also, another aspect on do no significant harm is that a lot of times you don't really realized the way that all of these systems are quite interconnected. I think there is a lot of new research that's coming in to sort of really help the ecosystem understand the level to which different factors are integrated in the way that a company operates. So just yesterday, AIGCC together with PwC released a nature dependency report that really highlights that across APAC, more than 53% of the gross value add last year was moderately or highly linked to nature dependencies. And I think this sort of research that really highlights the linkages amongst the different factors is really important. It clearly highlights the need for financial institutions and companies to do their own diligences within this broader framework that's being set by taxonomies, and sort of really work on it together to understand how to sort of respond to it in an integrated manner as well.
Thanks, Anjali. Really, really good points. I think firstly, there is really an emerging trend of investors now understanding the importance of transition and having clarity that we can't flick a switch and turn green overnight. But the just transition aspects you talked about are also very critical because it is about the people. And if transitions are not just and they're not affordable, they become disorderly, and they hurt the very people we're trying to protect, which is our long-term generations. The other interesting thing you brought up, which is a very important point for all of us, is that we have a lot of interdependencies. And Peter mentioned that just now when he did his special address, that we're also looking at how we can integrate nature in transition plans. That's something we really cannot avoid. And certainly when it comes to adaptation, it is also very important. So Mitch, coming back to you, I was looking at the IE Sustainable Development Scenario, and when it comes to buildings, that scenario requires quite a bit of reduction in energy emissions moving forward. So you talked about the ASEAN taxonomy's role just now in helping orient capital, and I really wanted to ask you to perhaps give a bit more insights as to how the ASEAN taxonomy can help facilitate green and resilient building investments. Also, you've had a look at how the ASEAN taxonomy has created the technical screening criteria for the real estate and construction sector, and also how it's approached the different types of certifications and national certification bodies that you mentioned just now. So could you maybe give us a bit more insights into this?
Absolutely. So, I mean, one of the aspects we've just been talking about just transition, and I think it's important to try to frame this discussion in some elements that are a bit more tangible and concrete. When we talk about just transition, what do we mean in terms of the evolution of our current systems? What are we transitioning to, and what's the potential of these transitions? So when we look at examples through the lens of decarbonization of the building and construction industry, we have two primary pathways that have intrinsic economic value baked in. Transition to renewable energy and energy efficiency. So as you mentioned, the IEA targets appear ambitious at the outset, talking about energy reduction of 30%, 33%. These targets sound the bar sounds like it's set high. It's important to recognize that the bar is set high because we already have identifiable pathways to achieve those goals. Both energy and transition to renewable energy pay for themselves. The ROI is locked in and is intrinsic to a higher performing building. And so when we talk about just transition, let's game plan out what that looks like and what we mean. What we're talking about is a transition to energy independence, which is not a pipe dream 10 years, 20 years down the line. It's an opportunity to rethink our consumption of energy and how we treat energy as a disposable, consumable commodity. The sun doesn't charge us a bill for its power. It's a limitless power supply. You can't corner the market in solar energy. It's just how can you capitalize on it? And so when we talk about just transition, it allows us to envision a very near future where our low-cost housing developments are energy independent. Our national building infrastructure is energy dependent and freeing ourselves from international markets. And we talked about ripples and disruption to international energy markets. And this transition away from energy as a strict consumable commodity opens up new pictures and new avenues for opportunity that have the potential for very real impact on how we live, how we work, how we live in our cities, and how we take care of our communities. So this is not, it's really important to acknowledge that this is not pie in the sky, let's kick the can down the road to 2050. We have very real and intrinsically viable solutions available to us today. And the taxonomy provides a framework that allows large movements of capital to take advantage of these opportunities. So thank you.
And just to follow up on that, Mitch, what's your assessment of the way the ASEAN taxonomy has set the thresholds? Has that been something that's well received from your end?
Yeah, I mean, it has to be said that these cross-border frameworks are complicated. And the primary reason that the primary source of complexity is that all buildings are fundamentally local undertakings. You know, if you think about at a very basic level, the kindergarten that I send my children to is also a kindergarten that you send your children to, but they're located in different, I mean, it bears repeating. Building is local. And so developing a framework that is responsive to and inclusive of the tremendous diversity of not just where we live and what climate we're living in, but culturally, socially, it's important that we recognize the value of these local differentiation. We would not want to live in a world where all our buildings look the same and operate the same. And it also bears repeating that it's also one of the mechanisms that got us into this, at least in the construction sector, it's one of the issues that got us into this trouble in the first place. You know, the idea that a building that is located in Tokyo or Singapore or KL or Dallas, Texas, should look the same, operate the same, and will let the energy consumption, you know, sort out the differences in climate, is problematic. It doesn't. You know, the development of 20th century did not lend itself to very efficient and responsive buildings that were reflective of our local environment. So, apart from just energy independence, there's also an opportunity for our buildings in our cities to have a better reflection of the tremendous difference. So that's the bigger picture, but that's the sort of tightrope that a common framework like the taxonomy is walking, because it's critical that we're all speaking the same language. It's critical that we have conversion factors so that we're able to evaluate performance interoperably, but this also can run up against the importance of our regulation and our policies being intrinsic to where the building is located. So again, Eugene, just to go back to your question, the technical screening criteria in the taxonomy are high level. They are broad, and I think that they are also high level and broad with good purpose. Their role is to provide a common framework that provides confidence, risk risk management and evaluation of different projects that may be in different context. But leaving the intricacies of a building performance to local regulation is also a part of that story. We wouldn't want all of our building codes to be set at an international level. There are unintended consequences that result from having a building that was designed for London be plopped down in KL. It's not going to perform as it does in London. It's going to perform in a different way. And I would argue that it would perform less effectively as well.
Actually, I'm really glad you raised that point because not many people know this, but it is a design aspect of the ASEAN taxonomy to recognize that things shouldn't be the same, but there should be an equivalence given the context of the different economic activities, exactly like you've said. So that is why the taxonomy, ASEAN taxonomy, actually tries to build in these differences, but become the taxonomy of equivalence for the region, because we do need regional capital allocation.
One more thing to interject is that it's also one of the greatest potentials, drivers of these exercises, that we learn from each other. You know, the solutions that are applicable to my work in Malaysia may not be applicable to work in Singapore, work in Hong Kong, work in other member states, but they can inspire. So it may not be a direct translation, but we learn a tremendous amount from work that's done in Singapore, even though Singaporean solutions may not be applicable just across the border. So this cross-border communication, this cross-border capacity building is absolutely essential, even if we're following standards that are differentiated.
Great point, because actually at today's, this morning's ASEAN Taxonomy Board meeting, the board had discussed the value of cross-fertilization amongst ourselves, and that is certainly very key. Anjali, I just want to maybe digress a bit, and Datin Nazalina in her remarks just now talked about how we have decided to actually delay providing a discrete criteria, screening criteria for air transport. And I think she gave some very good reasons. So I just wanted to maybe to get a very quick view from you about how investors feel with approaches like that, where, you know, if we're not sure, we better not get into it yet, and let's do something that really works. The second question I wanted to ask you actually relates to an experience I personally had. So when we were looking at the technical screening criteria and approach for transportation and storage, I was actually just looking around at different approaches and how companies in this sector were reporting on it. And I was actually quite intrigued to find that Continental Tires, as a tire maker, had actually come up to provide support and guidance to users of their products as to how which products can actually help meet taxonomy requirements. It's so the way I look at it is that you'd never think a tire manufacturer would start thinking about telling users of vehicles or producers of vehicles that these tires will help you meet taxonomy requirements. And it got me thinking that taxonomies actually have a real trickle-down effect all the way down the economic value chain. I'm sure you see a lot of this as you deal with investors and how they're looking through the value chain. Maybe you can share a bit with us on this matter.
Sure. So maybe just to start with the aviation transport and integration of that sector into taxonomies, what we're seeing in EU and other markets. I mean, just firstly to sort of overall look at the aviation transportation sector. In terms of the flights itself, for long haul flights, you're not even seeing technology in place that will help you achieve a net zero aircraft, even in the next 10 years. Like, that technology is like a long-term sort of horizon that a lot of research and development is going into at the moment. When you look at the next step of, you look at the fuels and then you look at reduced emission aircrafts, there is a big demand for that, because there's a clear mandate that, you know, the aviation sector needs to transition, but there isn't enough economies of scale to allow all of these sustainable aviation fuel and low emission aircrafts to be accessible to all aviation players in the market at the moment. But there is a lot of efforts being sort of propelled towards that. So I think even with the EU taxonomy, it was only towards the end of last year that they announced the inclusion of the aviation transport sector in their taxonomy. So I think from an ASEAN perspective, there is, because ASEAN taxonomy is meant to be like one that evolves constantly. So I think there is a real opportunity to learn from what's happening in the EU market on aviation, how businesses are responding to it, and how financial sector is responding to it, because there is a lot of lessons to be learned in the approach to aviation, because it is a very sensitive sector where different markets are testing different policies as well. For example, in Singapore, you see a tax on customers for aviation already that will be fed into research and development for sustainable aviation fuels. So I think all of this is sort of ways to sort of look at the aviation sector, but there is a lot to sort of learn from each other and implement. So I think it's completely okay to sort of wait and watch and implement as what becomes workable for businesses and financial institutions from the other markets. But again, those developments there are quite interesting to sort of keep tab on. Personally, it's one of the sectors that I'm very interested in. And then Eugene, your sort of point about continental, actually, it's so interesting. I mean, when I read that as well, I was taken aback by how companies are really innovating to stay on top of their game. And I think more companies should really take the continental example and really create that momentum for high emission companies to sort of leverage on their supply chain to help these companies transition faster. So it can work both ways, right? It can work in a way that a high emitting company sets a long-term transition plan in place that mobilizes supply chains to sort of provide the appropriate products and services, but it can also work the other way, where companies in the supply chain really see the opportunity, create products, create services that will help these high emitting companies transition faster and stay relevant in the game. They're upgrading their businesses, they're staying relevant in the market, and they are beating their competition. It is just a clear example of how companies lower down in the supply chain can really up their game and stay in the competition by sort of using the signals that the taxonomy is setting out, even if there's delay in company level transition plans. And we hope to see a lot more of this in Asia. We're already seeing some good examples of supply chains for high emitting industries really look at the opportunities, but this is a clear example of companies that has really moved forward.
Your point, Anjali, about the taxonomy being a living document is actually very instructive, because we should do what we can right now. And that's why, of course, the taxonomy, ASEAN taxonomy, has a foundation framework, which is principles-based, because if we all wait for the perfect, time is limited and it really just doesn't work for us. And of course, that value chain and economic chain discussion is also critical, because it means that if you want to stay in the game, the taxonomy can help you see how the supply chain you're in or the value chain you're in is going to be affected, and you should respond accordingly. So Noda-san, not just in Southeast Asia, but everywhere in the world, we're trying to approach this decarbonization through three avenues. The first is, of course, we try and get zero emission assets. So we're building all these renewables as a first step. But we talk a lot about transition, and transition is really how do we make the dirty cleaner for now, pending us getting to that zero base. And the third aspect is really for us to be able to retire dirty assets faster. That's really tough, because many of these assets are locked in, and the coal fleet in Southeast Asia is really, really young. But it is important that we try and eliminate them as soon as possible. So I wanted to ask you for your views on the early coal phase-out criteria that the ASEAN taxonomy has. And indeed, it is actually the first regional taxonomy that has a coal phase-out criteria. I also wanted to ask you about making the dirty cleaner, and that's CCUS. We have a CCUS criteria as well. So if you could share some of your views with us, it'd be much appreciated.
So when I was reading the ASEAN taxonomy for the criteria for the GHG emitting the power, in order to stay in the amber tier by 2035, I recall it was 285 G of CO2 emission per kilowatt hour. That you have to be below that number undoubtedly intensity. So my understanding is that CO2 emission intensity for the gas and the coal-fired power plant is 400 and 800 respectively. So that implies that ASEAN taxonomy does assume that CCS technology gonna be ready by 2035. And if that's the case, we can still use the fossil fuel in the power. And that's, to some extent, that is encouraging because Japan also have a concept of zero emission power, which implies a fossil fuel, powered power station together with CCS. Now, and I think that is really kind of a challenging, but it's important, especially for the region who has the disadvantage introducing the renewables. So just investing in the green doesn't really solve the problem. And furthermore, the ASEAN region, where the economy is still growing, the energy demand is also growing. And just invest in the renewable from now until the next 30 years doesn't really, it's not, that problem is not that simple. So I know there is a coalition between, including Japan and ASEAN region to promote the CCS. And I think that is important. And one of the framework to kind of accelerate or to efficiently utilize the CCS, is my understanding, is a carbon credit framework. Because carbon credit is effectively the way to virtually transfer the CO2 from one country to another country. Now, the location suitable CCS is concentrated in certain areas. It's not everywhere. Japan doesn't have much, the capacity for the CCS. So for the orderly or maybe just transition in order to kind of accomplish that concept, carbon credit virtually transferring a CO2 and, kind of average out the emission reduction is, I think it's important. And another aspect the carbon credit is important is to how to kind of reward avoided emissions. And early retirement of the coal-fired power plant, the avoided emission kind of concept has to be established. Now, the most difficult part, apart of the replacing the coal-fired plant with alternative energy, obviously, if you retire early, you are missing the cash flow that you were expecting. And the question is how to fulfill the missing cash flow. And one of the answers is the carbon credit, because you are avoiding the future CO2 emission. And in order to reward that, someone can buy the carbon credit, evaluated from that kind of activities. So ADB ETM or the currently the MAS have traction working group. There are a lot of initiatives that is trying to develop the framework to embed the carbon credit to enable the early retirement of CLPP. And I think that is something that I think most of the discussion is led by the ASEAN region, and I think it is important to kind of establish that the framework to kind of model case the early retirement of such the dirty as you described.
Thank you. Yes, it does make a lot of sense because there is a cost to retiring assets that have locked in financial commitments. So we need to consider how to do that. But just because it's difficult to do doesn't mean we don't do it. So that's a very important message to us all. Mitch, coming back to you, the ASEAN taxonomy is not mandatory. And we, at the same time, have, like as we discussed just now, the need to consider both international and local building codes. But the ASEAN taxonomy does not endorse any particular international building code. So if you are in the industry, if you're in the sector, what should you do to prepare yourself to leverage and maximize the benefits of the ASEAN taxonomy?
Well, I think in many ways the construction and the building and construction sector is already ahead of the game when it comes to as compared to the underlying banking and financing. In many respects, it's because there is that direct financial incentive to make your product more efficient. You know, we're not talking about a financial mechanism. You know, there's a place for carbon credits. There's a place for a talk of net zero. But why would we talk about net zero when we can actually jump straight to zero? And there's a financial model and incentive in place to achieve those goals. You know, I wouldn't set up a financial mechanism to replace a light bulb when I can just replace the light bulb. And so I think that's one element that sort of differentiates and makes the building and construction sector more straightforward in certain respects. That because energy efficiency is in lockstep with profitability of a building as an asset, and a clear indicator of the economic performance of that asset, the role of the taxonomy as a driver of the industry, it performs a slightly different role. The role of the taxonomy and the driver of the industry is from more, I think, from on the financial side, on the banking side. How to evaluate whether or not, you know, as I mentioned before, how to capitalize on the risk management aspects of property development to have confidence that you're investing in a higher performing asset, or one that's more future proof, one that is more competitive in its local environment. So back to your question about the taxonomy, though, the main driver of the taxonomy, money is a powerful motivator. And we've seen across the board across jurisdiction that where incentives exist, they punch above their weight. So the prospect of having access to capital is a tremendous driver and accelerator of local codes, local performance, because the individual players within the industry are excited and eager to be in lockstep with those capital flows. Even in cases where actual access to capital may or may not exist, the prospect of a preferable rate or preferable incentive is often enough to generate enthusiasm. So that's what I see as the potential. I think it's really, though, a two-way street. We would not want to rely on a mechanism like the taxonomy to be the primary driver. This is an instrument that's designed to work in concert with local regulation, national regulations, and ultimately to be an accelerator, an enabler of those mechanisms. We shouldn't expect or want the taxonomy to be something in and of itself. It provides a key role in international capital flows, in facilitating cross-border investment, and that is a critical role. It allows us to work towards the objective where, ultimately, we shouldn't be talking about green finance or sustainable finance. We should be talking about finance. And the aspect of green or sustainable should be intrinsic to what makes something a value proposition, not on environmental terms, but on economic terms. For something to be environmentally sustainable, it first and foremost has to be economically sustainable. So this is what this conversation, why these mechanisms are important. But ultimately, this is the objective, that they're not differentiated, they're intrinsic to our economic performance.
Those are really important points as well. And I did read several reports that talked about the economic enhancement to rental, to building values by having them built in a sustainable way or even retrofitted. And I think that's an interesting discussion, the retrofitting as well.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the, this is a higher level, perspective, but as of 2023, according to International Energy Agency, investment in renewables surpassed investment in fossil fuels for the first time last year. And yet, for all of us, when we think about fossil fuels, we tend to still think of, oh, it's cheap electricity, it's cheap energy. This simply isn't the case, and the data actually bears that out. The cost of renewables is lesser than the cost of fossil fuels, but the perception is lags behind that. And so across industries, across sectors, this is the primary issue that we're facing. I mentioned at the outset that we have a perception gap in the construction sector. We think of a green building and we think an expensive building, even though the data actually doesn't support that conclusion. Sorry, Eugene, one small last thing. You mentioned existing buildings and retrofitting. And so, our Malaysia Green Building Council is a member of the World Green Building Council. It's an international network of green building councils representing over 80 countries. And the World Green Building Council has started talking about 1 billion better buildings. In Malaysia, we've extrapolated that to 1 million better buildings. And in order to achieve those objectives, it's absolutely essential to look at our existing building stock. The overwhelming majority of buildings that are going to take us through the next half century and century have already been constructed. And so this becomes the low-hanging fruit in terms of improving performance. It's a way to extrapolate the resilience of an asset into the future, extend the life of a building, extend the value of the building, and it's one that can be it's one that pays for itself. So energy efficiency, retrofitting, adoption of on-site renewables is something that, these are all strategies that extend the operating life, just in the way that a legacy energy provider may have an existing asset that they're looking for a way to extend its durability. The same is true of buildings. The difference may be is that we're not necessarily looking at some expensive technology to achieve that. When your light bulb burns out, you replace it with the most efficient light bulb that's available at the same price point. Straight away, you're increasing the operating efficiency of that light bulb by 30%. When you replace the air conditioning unit of your building, you replace it with the most efficient air conditioning unit that you can afford. Your additional expenditure is zero, but you enjoy an operational saving. So even if you have no additional budget, your buildings require maintenance. And if you have no additional budget above and beyond what your operational budget is, you can still achieve that 30% savings that we talked about earlier. So from that perspective, we talked about 30% energy savings sounding like an ambitious target. In practice, it's essentially business as usual. All you have to do is put that goal, put that objective, put that priority alongside the objectives of your organization.
So I'm just looking at the questions that we received, and one of them actually relates to what you just said, because it says, Mitch, do you have any tax benefit from obtaining a green certification or funding assistance from the local regulator? And what you're really saying is that you don't need that to incentivize yourself financially to go green.
I'm not saying that.
But you shouldn't rely on that.
What I'm saying is that incentives are powerful tools, but the underlying an incentive will not change the underlying financials. And when it comes to green and sustainable, the underlying financials already are in lockstep. It already makes sense. The incentive becomes an accelerator, but This is a change. This is something that's occurred within the last 5-10 years. This is something that is an ongoing process. The challenge is that we're in the mode, and I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about across sector, across industries, that green comes with compromise. That green is, and the economics, we have to delve into externalities in order to justify the bottom line. And this is increasingly an obsolete point of view. Now, we just talked about the airline sector. There are certain sectors that are at different stages. This is not true universally across the board, but this is increasingly where how the economic landscape is evolving.
So there's actually a follow-on question, Sunoda-san, from your point about carbon credits, and also for you, Anjali. How do you link the different initiatives within the ASEAN strategies to accelerate the carbon neutrality journey, particularly on carbon markets and the taxonomy?
So, can you elaborate the question? So,
It says, how do you link the different initiatives within ASEAN strategies to accelerate the journey towards carbon neutrality,
Right.
particularly those relating to carbon markets and
Okay.
the taxonomy? So I think they're trying, so it links kind of to your,
Sure,
to a bit to what you said just now with the early retirement
Right.
and carbon credits.
okay, so I think that's the good. For instance, if you look at the SBTI, basically the concept is that you cannot really heavily rely on the carbon credit. First of all, you have to do your effort to eliminate the CO2. But if there is a residuals, maybe you can apply the offsetting. So that's the. But I think, especially for the Japan, for instance, carbon neutral by 2050 is a very, the challenging task. And as an interim, we do have to rely on the coal-fired power plant, for instance. So the question is, as an interim, can you just sit there and do nothing? And I think I'll answer this. So SBTI also does encourage you to, contribute outside the value chain or beyond value chain in the term as a kind of interim activities. So while you do have to do your own effort to clean up your dirty asset, as you described, but on the other hand, as an interim, I think it is important to contribute beyond the value chain. And one of the, the tactics, the way to contribute beyond the value chain is, involving the carbon credit market or facilitating the carbon credit. So that's kind of my, understanding.
And what you're saying is actually very consistent with the ASEAN Capital Market Forum's transition finance guidance, which actually says that you can use carbon credits because obviously it imposes a cost to the polluters, but you should only use it as a last resort when you don't have any options. And again, while this debate goes on and on, allowing very restricted use of carbon credits is better than not doing anything in some people's minds. So I think the SBTI approach, like you mentioned also, is something that is interesting to consider. And we should look at it not as the solution, but as a complementary interim. Anjali, do you want to?
Yeah, I just want to sort of add to this as well. Like when you're sort of seeing investors engage with companies, and companies are developing quite ambitious transition plans in the absence in some sectors of technology that will actually enable them to achieve net zero within sort of more ambitious timelines for net zero. The role of carbon credits really comes in there, especially for sort of residual emissions that the company is not in control of, but sort of wants to achieve that net zero target. So you're seeing increasingly companies looking at alternate solutions like, carbon credits to really fill in that gap, and asking of investors' views if that is sort of an acceptable way. And it is being accepted into a lot of standards. So if there's a way for ASEAN markets to also look into creation of credible carbon credits to help investors supplement that emission gap as well as residual emissions that would help in company strategies.
Useful points, Anjali. Another question for you, Mitch. Let me just get in. So this is in reference to the low budget green buildings versus high budget green buildings. And the question is, how does it differ? And it further goes on to say, I've heard of the reduction of windows to reduce heat implications, but this would detract from the building's aesthetics. What's your view on this?
Well, I should be maybe be a little bit more clear when we talk about high budget green buildings, low budget green buildings. Really, what we're talking about is just buildings. The idea that there's something that is intrinsic or inherent to make a building green is a little bit of a false construct. You know, our buildings have performance, and our buildings are perform in many different ways. We wouldn't necessarily look at one building. You know, we're sitting in a hotel now. Can you tell by looking at it, is this an expensive hotel? Is this a cheap hotel? You know, how much did this hotel cost? All we can say for certain is that this hotel was built with a budget. Whether that budget was high, low, somewhere in between, is a response to a number of different multivalent factors which are opaque. And so the idea that we can look at a building and say, this is green, this is a budget, the role of and the complexity of green building and building benchmarks is that, you know, reflects the diversity of the environments in which we inhabit, and they preclude easy reading. They are extremely complex undertakings, but at the fundamental level, what a green building rating system is or certification system is a benchmark. And so we are attempting to evaluate a building performance against a common set type building typology, common jurisdiction. However, these are not absolute metrics. They are a tool. And like any metric or any tool, the utility of the tool is not inherent to the tool itself. It's what you use that tool to achieve. So I think it's important to, sometimes there's a compulsion when we talk about sustainability, to talk about issues of sustainability, and especially international, cross-border. There's a predilection to talk about these issues in absolutes. And the complexity of how a building operates on the ground is response to many different factors. We can draw conclusions. That the question asked about the size of the window, the orientation of the window. When we look at a building design, the most important thing, singular most important thing, is that that building is designed to respond to its local context, who's using the building, how they're using the building, what the economic and regulatory systems are involved in that jurisdiction, what the climate is, and to make decisions that are responsive to that on the ground. Within that, there's a lot of avenues that are open. So
It's really important for us to remember that the ASEAN taxonomy is an outcomes-based taxonomy, as you've sort of highlighted, because we are more interested in what outcomes do you get as a result of using the taxonomy, and that is the main driver.
But one other small element that I think is a useful thought exercise. If you go back, and this is a true no matter what country you come from, where in the world you live, if you look at how buildings looked 150 years ago, you know, when some banks were first being founded, those buildings will reflect a very efficient way of building. And we don't think about our vernacular building styles as being necessarily high tech. but they are environmentally responsive. And so when we look at those building strategies, those building techniques, and look back, what can we learn from how buildings responded to their local environment in the past? It's a useful tool because we don't necessarily look at a traditional house, whether it's in the countryside in England, or I don't want to pick on any one country too much, but no matter where in the world, if you think about the house that your grandparents or your great-grandparents grew up in, these by and large are efficient buildings because they were designed to not use energy source to mitigate climate. And I'm not advocating that we go back to live how we did 150 years ago, just that it's a useful indicator of how we can learn lessons. There's lessons that we can draw that are still applicable today, but we have many more tools at our disposal now.
So a quick one, Anjali, I think coming back to the point about developed countries and emerging markets and developing countries, there's a question which I will rephrase on how we get investors and banks to be able to reconcile the differences and to be able to best help provide the capital to address both needs.
So, I mean, I think one of the our associate organizations, IGCC, which is an investor association based in Australia, did this report quite recently to sort of look at what is hindering capital flows from Australia into emerging markets, developing economies. And a lot of the responses, as you can imagine, is sort of related to policy signals, risks that some of them are really perceived risks that needs to be worked on. Some of them are a bit more tangible in terms of Forex risks and others that really needs to be addressed. But one of the major sort of factors that came out from that report, which was quite interesting, was that the understanding of capital providers in developed markets, of emerging markets and developing economies, it's not good enough. They need to understand these markets better. And that was something that came out quite clearly through this survey. And then we sort of looked at what are the existing mechanisms outside of a taxonomy that exists for these financial capital providers to understand these markets better. So one good example that we saw between Australia and DFAT was where the Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia, so they sort of provide funding to ASEAN countries on a yearly basis to help them develop a report that clearly identifies in terms of a transition, where does capital need to go. This was before the taxonomy came into picture. This has been happening for years. So I think when you sort of look at that existing framework before the taxonomy came around, it was really modeling a taxonomy framework, right? Where government in a developed market was providing capital to governments in developing markets to really provide a clear picture on where the market is currently and where does capital need to go, so the governments can work together to help mobilize capital to flow in terms of climate finance. And that's really what's come together in terms of a taxonomy, and following that, the transition planning framework as well, which really mobilizes a market and all of the business players in that market to be able to clearly provide a picture of what is happening in the market, where does that capital need to go, and really enable comparisons as well, which will enable developed capital market players to really understand where they can sort of provide capital in a way that is credible as well.
Right. So the decarbonization strategy is also the industry transformation strategy or the industry promotion strategy. And from that regard, if you look at the ASEAN and Japan as a whole, and think about how we can kind of mutually benefit, promoting the industry, region as a whole, and also achieving the decarbonization at the same time, there is a good opportunity or incentive for instance, Japanese bank to finance in the ASEAN region and vice versa. For instance, I mentioned about the CCS. So developing a CCS, obviously there is a kind of mutual beneficial relationship between the ASEAN region and Japan. Establish a new supply chain for the hydrogen. Japan cannot do alone, so that I guess ASEAN region have to together develop the the supply chain, taking account they have a kind of mutually, or complementary relationship. So yes, thinking about how to, eliminate the CO2, that is important. But I think you should add how to kind of, turn that into the kind of the growth strategy, and also, thinking an ASEAN or the Asia as a whole, then I think you will come back, up with a kind of opportunity from finance perspective, for instance, to, do the lending or do the investing in any region that's appropriate.
Thank you very much, Anjali and Sunoda-san. Well, with that, we're exactly at 4:30. So thank you very much to our panelists for sharing all your insights. I think it's been really beneficial for all of us. And we hope to have this dialogue continue into the future. So can I just ask everyone to give a hand to thank our panelists for spending their time with us? Thank you. And I shall hand it back to the MC. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eugene, and thank you as well to our distinguished panelists for sharing their insights today. It has truly been a fruitful session and hopefully one of many more to come. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our event today. But we do invite everyone to peruse the ASEAN Taxonomy Version 3 document via the links provided previously. Thank you once again for taking the time out of your day today to spend with us. We hope you've had and enjoyed this session. Take care, stay safe, and see you again soon. Thank you very much, everyone.